So what we're going to talk about this evening is about the stages of dementia. And that's what we mean by that. We're talking about the three stages of dementia. And we're talking about early stage, middle stage and late stage. And we know that families, when you're living with dementia, you often want to kind of know what might happen, this progression look like over time, how this condition might affect you and your loved one. What I'm going to say right at the offset is that it will vary from person to person. And, when somebody gets diagnosed, you don't exactly know how someone's going to progress through these stages. It's impossible to say how long each stage will last. So, whilst we're talking about these different stages, you kind of always have to bear in your mind that it's a little bit impossible to say whether we're talking about a stage that's going to last for months or years or progress rapidly or not. So that's something to just bear in mind. And some of the factors that will affect someone's deterioration, it could be something like how soon somebody receives that diagnosis after the onset of the symptoms. And we know that for lots of people, they don't actually get a diagnosis straight away. It takes a while, and and receiving that diagnosis can actually take a couple of years. So at what point you might be then will depend on how you've declined already. A person's age will have an impact on how quickly they progress through the stages that we're going to talk about. The type of dementia that somebody has will have an impact, as will somebody's physical and mental health. So all of these things are going to play an impact. And I guess the really important thing to mention is that a person's lifestyle factors, their diet, their exercise, how fit and healthy they are, can also have an impact on their progression. So just that's the kind of caveat that I want to add, in a way, that whilst we're talking, just bear in mind, it's not a hard and fast, this is the stages that you're going through. And I'm sure my other speakers will talk to this later on. So I'm going to start with you, Sheridan, if I can. I know you mentioned earlier on that you're one of our Admiral nurses, but do you want to just unmute and tell us a little bit more about how long you've been an Admiral nurse for, quickly, and then I'm going to ask you a few questions, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course. So I've been an Admiral nurse for 6 years. I've worked as an Admiral nurse within an acute hospital, within a community mental health team, and within a primary care network, so with GPs and things like that. And I also work on the helpline and the virtual clinics as well.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sheridan. So lots and lots of experience and knowledge. And I'm sure, you've worked with many people in early stage dementia, actually. So can you tell us a little bit more about that? What is early stage dementia? What do
So
we mean?
yeah, so early stage dementia, people might start to experience some problems that are affecting their everyday living. So sometimes the person may notice the changes themselves, or it might actually be recognised by their friends and family at first. But because they can be so mild, it can be quite difficult to pinpoint. So sometimes people are a bit reluctant to consider it as dementia. But you might start to see, short-term memory, maybe slow thinking processes, the difficulty taking on board instruction and things like that, word finding difficulties, things like that.
So whilst we all know, don't we, that we all forget things from time to time. Everybody listening tonight and everybody everywhere will at times not remember something, or go into a room or forget what they've gone in for, or forget a plan or an arrangement. We're talking about something more than that at this stage, or is it that kind of thing still?
No, it's definitely something more. It's things that can affect your everyday life. So you might you might not be able to recognize objects and things like that, or forget what the names of objects are. Maybe so these sorts of issues are affecting your everyday life and your ability to do everyday tasks, and that's when it becomes notable. So going into a room and forgetting what you came in for, but you always remember when, if there is no cognitive issue, you will eventually remember what you've gone in for, whereas that's not the same with dementia. It's more pronounced than that.
Yeah, and I think in these early stages at getting that diagnosis, it can, depending what type of diagnosis you've got as well. You know, you could also experience depression as well, couldn't you? And other
Absolutely.
things as well.
Anxiety is really common actually, and
Mm-hmm.
sometimes people get diagnosed with anxiety
Mm-hmm.
because that's how it might present to somebody, but what they're anxious about is the fact that they are struggling
Mm-hmm.
with some of the everyday to remember how to do everyday things, and that's what's causing the anxiety, or the
Mm-hmm.
fact that they are aware that they are struggling to interpret information and things like that. So anxiety can be a really big feature for a lot of people,
Yeah.
particularly in those early stages. People can get quite low in mood as well if they realise there's some issues going on.
Yeah, and I suspect actually, like you just said there, if you start to have this awareness that these issues going on, that there's things that you're perhaps missing, or things that you're getting misplacing, or getting lost in familiar places, that is going to make you feel anxious, isn't it?
Yeah,
If you're
absolutely.
aware of that,
Yeah.
you're going to be aware of that. And at that point, I think at the early stages of dementia, I think it's important to say that people might still be working. If they're younger, they might still be driving a car, looking after children or grandchildren, and actually still living quite I'm doing inverted commas, but a kind of normal life, getting on with things,
Yeah.
and not necessarily at that stage. Whilst it's obviously some people are going to have low mood and anxiety, or maybe some behavioural changes that are more pronounced. Other people at this early stage can actually, as I said, still work and drive, and we do definitely see that, don't we?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And then obviously there's all different types of dementia as well. So if somebody's got more of a frontal temporal dementia, you might not see changes in their memory. You might see more changes in their behaviour,
Mm-hmm.
and things like that first. So inhibitions, acting impulsively, things like that. So it's not always about memory. It really does depend on the type of dementia as well.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important thing. So at this point as well, if we kind of go that we're talking from the point that someone's got a diagnosis and they've received that diagnosis, what kind of supports around for them at people at that point? I guess that's going to vary where they are in the UK, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously, most people will get a diagnosis through the memory clinic, and then each local memory clinic will have their own pathway. Usually, people get discharged back to the GP,
Mm-hmm.
and then it depends on what's available in your local area. But there is obviously you have got the Admiral Nurse Dementia Helpline available,
Yes.
or the virtual clinics as well,
Yeah.
if you're not sure what's available in your local area. Uh,
Yeah. And I think that's key, and I think that it depends as well on what type of dementia someone's got, what support they might get, because
Absolutely.
if you receive a diagnosis of Alzheimer's, you might well be started on one of the medications that are used, and then monitored over that period. And whereas I know other people who've received other diagnoses where medication isn't used to help treat the symptoms. Sometimes people actually don't necessarily get an awful lot of support at that time, or they get given a pack or a booklet, don't they? And
Yeah. Yeah.
off you go. So I guess it is going to vary, but you're quite right to mention our services and our helpline, our bookable appointments that people can book, and I'll share some information into the space later if people want to know more about that. That was really helpful to think through that early stage. So Christine, can I ask you to join us at this point, please, and just tell us a little bit about, because of who you are as well, and why we've asked you to come and speak to us this evening.
My husband had young onset dementia. He had PCA, posterior cortical atrophy, and corticobasal in the latter stages.
Mm-hmm.
He was 58 when he was finally diagnosed. And I was his full-time carer for the last 7 years of his life. But it was interesting just listening to Sheridan describe the early stages. I would say we probably missed the early stages.
Mm-hmm.
Looking back, there were clear signs when he was 50, But for about 4 years, we probably had the worst 4 years of our marriage, in that he was just a nightmare. He'd promised to do things and they wouldn't happen, but he always seemed to remember things that were to do with his motorbikes. So we never suspected a memory issue. It felt more like he was just becoming very self-centered.
Yeah.
And what brought it home to me was then one day I went out in the garage to get something, because you'll realise from the name I'm also a motorcyclist. And the garage was a tip. There were tools and stuff everywhere. I hadn't been out there for ages. I worked full time. And I went back in and I said to him, Trevor, what is going on in the garage? And he just looked at me with the most frightened look on his face and said, I have no idea. I don't know where anything goes anymore. And his garage had always been immaculate. When we got married, it was the first place that was carpeted. It was the first place that was heated. His garage was always immaculate. And it was at that point I realised we needed to get some advice. This wasn't just him. And I would say things had been going on for about 4 years. He took early retirement a year later on my advice. It then took us a further 4 years to get diagnosed. So he was finally diagnosed 8 years after the first signs.
So that's a really long time, actually, if you couple that with what you said about the fact that it took a while to kind of perhaps notice and work out what was going on. Do you mind me asking why it took so long? Was that because of his age, or did you go through other sort of
the
diagnosis?
actual diagnosis, originally they did the usual, it's depression. Clearly he's depressed, his world's fallen apart. It's being caused by workplace stress, which in a way you could understand, because he was struggling at work. He was turning up to the wrong meetings and taking the wrong notes, etc. So that's why I got him to take early retirement at 55. We could afford for him to do that. And then we waited 9 months and went back and saw the doctor again, and he said, I still think this is workplace stress. And I said, touche, he's not been at work for 9 months, think again. And then they just tested for everything else. They tested for brain tumours, neurological, you name it. It took that long to finally come to the diagnosis.
Yeah, and I think we know that when someone's younger, we know that route to diagnosis takes longer, and in lots of ways it's good, isn't it, that they do all these tests and rule all of these things out, but that whole process takes so long, and whilst you're waiting you're kind of left not sure what it is, and is it a tumour, which would obviously be horrible, is it dementia, is that equally as horrible, and actually all of that emotion and anxiety that you're holding as well during that period, trying to work out what's actually going on. Can you remember what support you received once you got the diagnosis?
None.
Okay. Okay. I mean,
none. We on the day of the appointment, by the time the final diagnosis came, we more or less knew what it was. In my previous life, I was an academic researcher, so I'd looked enough up online to have a pretty good idea and forewarned Trevor. At the appointment, the consultant said, you've got young onset dementia. Your life expectancy from this point is about 5 to 7 years, of which you can expect the last 2 of however long to be in an institution. Have you got any questions? We didn't have any in that immediate. He told us what medication he was going to be started on and discharged us to the GP.
Yeah, I mean, that's Oh, you saw the emoji I shared, but that sort of story is just it's horrific to think that you would be given that diagnosis that way, and just but I know it's not, sadly it's not uncommon actually, is it, that people at this point are not really given quite what we might like to think of in terms of support. And I think sometimes in the defense of the GPs, it's just because they actually haven't, there isn't anything in their area to give people, you know, there really isn't always that support, you know, that you might get if it was a different diagnosis that would be there to wrap around you. Oh gosh, well, thank you, Christine, for sharing all of that information. I honestly might, yeah. I mean, we're going to hear from you throughout the space, so this is not the end of us you some questions. Can I ask you both at this point, if you think to early stage, what is there any specific tips that you would share at this point for anybody?
I think if there are looking for key things that have changed, for me, it was the garage. I wish I'd gone out in the garage earlier.
Mm-hmm.
But as I say, it felt at the time like we were falling apart because there was so much that he'd always done he just didn't do. But it appeared the motorbikes were always running.
Uh-huh.
I think to look for the key thing. So they might be a fisherman and they always go out, and then you discover one day they've gone out and the fish bait box is still in the fridge, or they always do X. It's that thing they've always done where it then starts to go wrong, I think, that is potentially the key.
Yeah, that's a really good tip actually. I like that. Sheridan, any that you would suggest for early stage or people who might be in the early stage, any key tips that you can think of?
Yeah, well, yeah. For me as a nurse, I would say, you know, the fact is you can still be quite independent with a lot of your daily living, and it's to maintain that, really maintain the activities that you can do, and find ways around some of the difficulties that you have. And obviously, family members, loved ones, spouses, they'll be key to that. They'll be key to recognizing things. So sometimes making small changes can really help the person to remain independent. And it's about focusing on strengths, and it's about also thinking about empowering somebody to maybe think about their future, because this is the stage to do that, because you know you're still likely to have capacity to make some really important decisions about what you do want in the future as well. So, and that's another way of empowering that person to still have a voice as dementia progresses.
I love that actually, because when you get a diagnosis of dementia, you know that, you know, it's a progressive degenerative condition. It's going to get worse over time, and actually there's probably a bit of a temptation to read everything and find out everything that you can, which is probably human nature. But actually, the really good thing to think about is actually what support do we need as a family? What can help us? Have we got things like power of attorney set up? What rights do we need? Do we need attendance allowance? What you know, just to start thinking in a slightly practical way as well. And I completely agree that, you know, I at that early stage, it's a good opportunity to kind of do some of that planning and to think about that whilst you've still got that capacity and that ability to do it. Make your wishes known, I guess. So
Yeah, absolutely, because it really helps for people to understand what your values are and what your needs and wants are as things progress, and your voice is heard beyond dementia, and
yeah.
that's really important.
I love that. Right, I'm going to move us on a little bit to mid stage, and I do want to manage to do mid and late stage. It's quite a lot we've got packed in tonight, and I do want to take some space for questions later on. I know there's been a request, but I'm not going to just pick that up just yet. If you want to put a question in the chat box, do, but we'll pick it up towards the end that way. So when we think middle stage dementia or that mid stage dementia, what do we mean there, Sheridan?
You might start to see you know, the mild difficulties that you might have at the beginning stages. You might find that they're more pronounced. It's starting to really affect their ability to live without some form of support from somebody else. So you might start to think about needing some support around food preparation, medications, washing, that sort of thing. If not, then prompts at least around those sorts of really important things. You might see a few changes in behaviour. So, anxiety might increase. So you might start to see the person wanting to follow their partner or family member around, or the main carer. Um, and lots of carers report that the person can become quite anxious if they can't see them. So even if they've just nipped to the toilet, the person can get quite anxious. So it's about, you might see like difficulty with sleeping and things like that. And it's about understanding what you can get support with actually, and how you can make adjustments to try and improve these things. So obviously, and we might start to see something called sundowning as well, which is where somebody's getting tired towards the end of the day, and you might see an increase in confusion and distress as well. So they're the sorts of things that you might start to see towards the mid stages of dementia.
Thank you, Sheridan. And I'm sure, listening to Sheridan talking there's lots of people who would say, yeah, that sounds fairly typical, because I think this is the stage of dementia that, we're slightly more familiar with, aren't we? We're slightly more
Yeah.
sort of used to perhaps seeing that presentation, or thinking through that way, and so that's possibly the more familiar stage to lots of people when we talk about this. So is at this point, I guess the support that's available, it's the same story, isn't it? It's going to vary depending on where somebody is, and in the country, and actually the way that you're going to manage any of these things that Sheridan spoke about. So whether it's sundowning or somebody's changes in their perceptions or memory problems, don't forget there's lots of information on the Dementia UK website and on other sites as well that will give all sorts of tips and hints about how to cope with this mid stage of someone's dementia. So Christine, can I come to you again at this point? Listening to Sheridan talking about that, and outlining that the mid stage, and when we talk about that, what memory do you have of this time in your life? What was that like?
But I sort of, in my head, I sort of split early, middle, and late, as early was pre-diagnosis and the first 2 years, and then the middle was once I'd given up to care full time for him.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, by then he'd already progressed to, he couldn't cook for himself. If I wasn't about, in fact, he didn't eat.
Mm-hmm.
He was still capable of feeding himself, but he couldn't get himself organised. And that's why I had to give up work, because I realised he wasn't eating all day while I was out of the house. He wasn't drinking all day while I was out of the house.
Mm-hmm.
He had by this time lost his driving licence because of the dementia. So he had got a bit depressed as well. And he used to cycle a lot, and he'd started getting lost while he was out cycling, and I would get a phone call to say, can you come and pick me up? And I'd say, where are you? I'm in a village. Okay. Can you describe the village? Well, there's a red thing next to me, which could be a phone box, could be a post box. As it happened one day, it turned out it was a fire hydrant or something, So it was obvious that I couldn't stay at work and allow that to carry on. However, anybody who's followed me on Twitter knows the point at which I gave up work to care for him full time. I said to him, look, I've given up my career. We've got a bucket list to hit. We've got to get on with this. And we did. I've heard of other people being told that you shouldn't consider taking people abroad. From mid-stage onwards, they get too confused and everything else. We had 5 years of foreign holidays.
Wow.
Airlines are amazing. Resorts are amazing. We had all sorts of hobbies. Trevor took up running. he'd never been a runner. We took up running, we took up park run, he took up bowls. When he could no longer ride his push bike, we bought a tandem, which he raced with our eldest son. Once he wasn't safe on the tandem, we took up horse riding. He forgot how to swim. I got him lessons. He relearned to swim. You know, I think it's too easy to see it as the middle stage and, oh, they've progressed and let's find a comfy armchair. For me, that was once I'd given up work to care for him and all I had to do all day was come up with activities for the two of us to do. We had a fantastic time. Absolutely fantastic. And I'm really glad we had that time because that has completely changed my memory of those 4 years when I thought we were rocky. It was a completely different experience. And yeah, along the way there were things. I mean, our last holiday in Tenerife, which was only 2 years before he died. Remember, he's supposed to be in an institution by now. He was by that stage completely blind, but from his dementia. Couldn't feed himself, couldn't take himself to the toilet, but my goodness, could he enjoy the sun on that balcony and the wine. And yeah, don't anybody at me about wine and the medication. He loved his wine. And olives, and we had a fantastic time. But as I say, he couldn't feed himself, couldn't take himself to the toilet, couldn't remember his way round, couldn't dress himself. So probably late middle stage, but we still went on holiday abroad.
Yeah. And that's perfect, a perfect example of the fact that in life you kind of have to take what might be perceived as risks. We all do it every time we go outside of our door. Well, even when we don't go outside of our door, we're taking risks, aren't we? And it's how do you continue to live a meaningful life and experience pleasure and happiness and peace and all of these things that we all want as humans? Where do you get them from? And what you've described, the holiday, the balcony, the olives, the horse riding, it just sounds like a fantastic action-packed happy life, which isn't that what we all want?
Yeah, I mean, we did have, I think it's about when I gave up work that we did get the powers of attorney, and Trevor put a DNAR in place. We did a care plan, and yeah, we had to put all that in place. And I say powers of attorney because I did my own as well, because obviously the person who would normally have had the say over my decisions would have been my husband. But if something happened to me, somebody still needed to have access to my bank accounts to be able to look after Trevor. Somebody needed to be able to make decisions about my health and welfare. So I've heard of other people get the power of attorney done for the person with dementia, but forget to do one for themselves.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You do have to take those things into consideration, don't you? And make those decisions about who's going to manage on your behalf as well. So yeah, you're absolutely very wise to point that out, Christine. Can I ask you another question? Because I remember when we were chatting earlier, you mentioned that actually at this point you also started to think about your home and the sort of the house situation. And this is something I'm really passionate about because I'm really interested in architecture and design and dementia and some of the adaptations and changes that people can make to enable them to carry on living this positive life. Can you tell us a little bit about what changes you made at that point?
Well, partly through my research and finding out I'd more or less established that Trevor had PCA. We were never told by the original specialist. And I did, through that research, get him referred to the rare dementias unit.
Mm-hmm.
But it was obvious he was going to lose sight and spatial awareness. So I did the most, and I agreed it with Trevor, did the most undementia friendly thing you could possibly do. And we completely redecorated the whole house. We have a lovely photo of the two of us sitting in our lounge, living room, with water running down the windows from where I've had the replastering done. And we have 2 bedroom chairs to sit on because I sold all of our downstairs furniture. I had additional lighting put in. So my friend said I had to pull the blinds in the evening, otherwise I'd have aircraft landing on the front lawn. The lights were that bright, because for a while before he completely lost his vision, he was going to need good lighting. There was no carpets or joins between rooms, so there was nothing to trip. The furniture I bought was all heavy, solid furniture, so that if he wobbled and leant on the furniture didn't move and it didn't break. I had handrails put up both sides of the stairs so that we could keep stairs for as long as possible. Trying to think what else we did. Yeah, all the chairs, bought comfy armchairs that had arms and were shaped so that as he went back into them, he could put his hands on and lower himself into the armchair, which is why I'd had to get rid of the previous suite, because that wasn't what it was like.
It sounds like it's so much, so much planning and thought, and actually, whilst actually getting on and living your life as well, went into this stage, and I'm sure that was all really, therapeutic and beneficial actually in the long term, because you were kind of thinking specifically about the issues that might come up. What could you do now to try and mitigate some of those risks and things in the future? And actually, what you also mentioned that I thought was really important was about doing research and finding out, and gathering that information so you could make the right choices really about what to do. So it sounds if you've given us a really good illustration of what that mid stage might look like. But actually I get what you've said a few times, is that it's sometimes a bit hard to quite tell where you are at, and actually what's going on, and some of the things that you were talking about might lead us on to thinking about late stage, because you mentioned Trevor's eyesight and other things as well, and I know obviously he had PCA, so it's slightly different with PCA. But can I go to you, Sheridan, and just move us on to late stage at this point? Because I think it feels right to do that now. What do we mean by late stage? What are we actually talking about at that period?
So this is where usually somebody's probably becoming more like completely dependent on others for all aspects of daily living. And it's hard for some people. Some people may progress into the late stages really slowly, and it happens over a longer length of time. And some people find that because of the comorbidities, so physical health issues and things like that, or things that happen, people can dip into this quite quickly. I know some people have felt that, but they basically become completely dependent on others for all aspects of daily living. They might have communication difficulties, so not be able to communicate verbally their needs and wishes, loss of recognition of loved ones and an environment where they are. You might see some distress as a result of this. So and physical changes as well. So people might be more prone to infection and delirium, have mobility issues, have continence issues, and issues around eating, drinking, and swallowing. So this is where your approach, your support network, all these things are really important factors as people start to come into the later stages.
I guess, like Christine was talking earlier, though, it's not that easy sometimes, is it, to tell what stage you might be in at that point, because some of the things that you described, Christine, potentially sounded more like they might be late stage, but actually at this same point Trevor was horse riding, wasn't he? So can you tell us what was that like for you, Christine? And would you
Yeah, I think
go on?
some of these things, they, yeah, I don't know, as I've said before, that we really split it. So some things, as I say, I've been chopping food, dicing his food for 2 or 3 years before I personally would have described him as late stage, because he couldn't cut up his own food. He could still chew the food. He had a really good chew, but he couldn't bite things off or cut them up. And yeah, by the time his last horse riding lesson was only a year before he died. And by that stage, he was probably very, very dependent. And the riding school had a very non-British Horse Society method for getting him onto the horse, which involves somebody holding a bucket of horse nuts under the horse's head, so it put its head down so that we could get Trevor to swing his leg over the front, and somebody the other side, I would throw his leg over the horse and somebody the other side would catch his leg and put it down into the stirrup. But once he was in place, he enjoyed the riding, and the riding school were prepared to let us risk the fact that Trevor might fall off. And I think that's important. It's that balance between wrapping somebody in cotton wool and allowing them to have some risk. I think that, and you said, Sheridan said earlier about making sure your wishes are clear. Trevor was very clear. His actual desire from pretty much when he was diagnosed was, once we started park running, his dearest wish was to get a PB and drop dead as he cross the finish line.
Mm-hmm.
And he always carried his DNAR with him in the hope that that might happen. It didn't in the end.
Mm-hmm. And did he get that PB?
He got several PBs. He had, my two sons took him out. He never got it with me. He always was quicker than me.
Yeah.
That brought me actually if I can just go back a little bit, Victoria, when Sheridan was talking about support, I think we sometimes forget how much support people in the community can be, not specialists.
Yeah.
Parkrun is a good example. Trevor ran faster than me. So he was finished and through the finish line. And one time he completely wandered off looking for me without realising that I was still running. I mentioned to the organisers that this had happened, and they actually had a volunteer role that was Trevor catcher. When Trevor finished, somebody would be at the end of the funnel, collect him and get him to come and cheer me across the finish. So we could still park run.
Oh, I love it. But that's perfect, and you're so right that support, it can be all sorts of places, can't it? It doesn't actually have to be professional support at all, and I love that idea. That's fantastic. I'm going to move us because we've had a couple of questions come in, so I'm going to ask us to have a little look at those questions and try and do some answers to them. So we've got a question from Barry, and I think you're still in the space, Barry. Yes, you are. I don't know whether you asked this slightly before we answered it or not, but I'm going to ask you to have a look at this one, Sheridan. So Barry's asked, he said he never really understood what potential early symptoms of dementia look like and how it varies from person to person. But can you give some examples of that? Are you happy to do that one for us, Sheridan?
Yeah, sure. So some early examples. So say if it's the most common form of dementia is Alzheimer's. So say if it was more of an Alzheimer's type of dementia, you might see people just not being able to recall recent events at all, even despite prompting, they just can't recall it. Repeating themselves a lot. That's another one. And difficulties thinking things through as well and planning. So they might get confused more easily and more stressed around things like their finances and problem solving and things like that. And obviously, if you've got other types of dementia, so frontal temporal, you would see changes in mood and personality. And like Christine alluded to, there's issues around perceived empathy as well. So some types of dementia don't always have the traditional memory loss as one of the first features, and I think that's important to be aware of. It's general changes that affect their everyday life, really, that you want to look out for. And also going to the GP about these changes, even if you're not sure if it's dementia, because there can be other physical health issues that cause difficulties with cognitive issues that could actually be treated. So it might not be dementia. So just going to speak to your GP about any concerns you've got can be really, really important, because if it is something treatable, then that's people often worry about dementia and then don't realise there's other things that can cause cognitive issues as well. So I think going to see the GP initially can be really, really important about any concerns that you've got.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Sheridan. So I know, Barry, you asked a question as well about when we say memory issues, and does that differ from the kind of typical things that you might see? And I think, as we get older, we might retire, we might be less active, we might, although clearly not when Christine was talking about what they got to, but lots of people do. And of course, that can lead to people getting a bit more confused, because you're not as structured as you might have been when you're working and doing all the other busy things that we do. So for some people, when they get older, they do start to see a little bit of maybe that not quite sharp in their cognition or their thinking, but dementia is really something different to that. It's when this is having an impact on your day-to-day life, your skills, your ability to cope and do things. And I think the other thing to mention, again, because I think it's pertinent to your question, is that dementia isn't just memory issues. So it's not just forgetting things. It might be communication difficulties, changing perceptions, personality changes, or even changes in your ability to move about, so postural difficulties and mobility difficulties. So it's more than just memory difficulties, and I think that's always worth reminding people of. So I'm going to move us to another question, and Christine, I'm going to bring this one to you, which you might have guessed if you've noticed it at the top of the screen. So I'm going to try and pronounce your name right. It's Muzana, I think, Muzana T, and apologies if I've got that wrong. So you've asked a question which I'm going to direct to you, Christine, because I think it's for you, which is, did you get any help from occupational therapy in terms of changes to the environment around your house?
No. At that stage, we didn't have really any external agencies involved. I'd been in touch with the Admiral nurse helpline when I'd been trying to find out exactly my suspicions about Trevor's type of dementia. And she had helped me get the referral to the rare dementias unit. I had some literature from them about the likely progression of PCA, and from that I put together the list of what we were going to do. The additional problem I had, and a lot of people won't have this problem, is that when I did have an occupational therapist to work with, she had no understanding of Trevor's rare type of dementia. And so I had to teach her about it before I could then get her to help us with specialist equipment.
Yeah, and I think that's, sorry, I didn't unmute to mean to quieten you down. It's fine to carry on, Christine.
No, it's fine. I think I've said, yeah, I didn't get the support. I think we've perhaps got more common sense sometimes than we credit ourselves with. Some of these changes are fairly obvious. I think that the difference here is it was Trevor's and my home, and we hadn't decorated for a while, so we did this crazy, we did it together, and he was part of it. He went out and helped choose the armchairs, etc. When it's your parents' house, I think trying to get those changes when they're saying, "Oh no, it's fine, I can manage that," and you think, "No, you can't." It's a very different issue, and I think in that case, it might be necessary to have an occupational therapist to offer that learned voice to yours. And I'm very aware of that, for example, with my father-in-law, who clearly thought he knew more than I did.
Yeah, you're absolutely right though. It's sorry.
Oh, it's all right. I
I was
finished.
just going to say you're absolutely right that if it's your home and it's your partner and your husband, it does change things dramatically. And if it's a parent, it can be even harder to make those changes. I think that leads us on in a way to another question, which is the one that Hustler Harms has asked, and which is about actually what to do if a person with dementia, the patient, feels that there's nothing wrong, and even if there's a family member, you can say changes in them, changes in memory loss and personality. How would you go about getting power of attorney and discussing financial matters? Can I ask you to pick that one up, Sheridan?
Yes, yeah, sure. So obviously, lasting power of attorney, it's probably good for anybody to have, really. Anybody who's got any sort of assets and pay the bills and things like that, because any one of us could fall down the stairs tomorrow and knock ourselves out and not be able to manage our affairs. So I don't think you have to frame it around dementia. I think if you frame it around, what if you had a fall and you wouldn't be able to get to the bank, and so we can help you with some of your things. So sometimes lasting power of attorney isn't necessarily around dementia. It's about being able to help somebody with and make decisions on somebody's behalf if they're not able to do it. And so maybe discussing it without the framing of dementia can be really helpful for some people if they don't recognise there's an issue with their memory, or it makes them distressed to think about it. Then framing it around the fact that anything could happen to any of us, and it's just generally a really good idea to have somebody that you trust and somebody that knows you to make some decisions on your behalf.
Yeah, and I think it is one of those really difficult things because the person themselves just might not really understand, and you could get to a point where somebody hasn't got the capacity to make those decisions about whether they want someone else to have power of attorney, or even get to the point where you're the person who, had they got capacity, they would have absolutely given it to, but because now the dementia and the symptoms, they may not want to do that, and so it can get complicated. So I absolutely agree. If you can get it set up before you even need it, but then in those early stages. Christine, do you want to come in here?
I was just going to say you could be doing it. You do your own power of attorney and speak with that person about it, saying, "I'm thinking of putting this in place. I've got to think about, who do you think, if it was you, who would you ask?" And go through it in that way. And perhaps if there's a couple of, if it's your parent, if there's a couple of children, if they each did their power of attorney, then the parent might see it as something that isn't linked to getting old. It's just something you do.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of tackling it, isn't it? And and trying to kind of almost normalize it. It's just something we're doing to get everything organized and in place. So I saw your heart emoji there, Hustler. So I'm assuming you're happy with the answer. So thank you for asking that question. Wendy Moore has asked a question about, would you get palliative care involved at the late stages? And I'm going to come to you to talk to that for a little bit, Sheridan. I'm just really mindful that, as always, these spaces go super quick. But if you're able to pick that one up for us, Sheridan, and I guess it's going to vary, isn't it? But what are you happy?
Yeah, yeah, of course. So, yeah, it's a really tricky one because a lot of people don't recognise, they don't always recognise dementia as a palliative condition in itself, and they don't always recognise um, the end stages of dementia. So we know that people with dementia don't always get a great or an equitable access to palliative services towards end of life. And I think this is why sometimes making an advanced care plan can be really, really helpful and important. And actually looking at, so as a condition, dementia is itself a palliative condition, so we would focus on quality of life, and it's about taking that quality of life approach throughout the trajectory of dementia can be really important, and getting the GP on board as well, because the GP can be really important in making sure that somebody's quality of life is optimised. So looking at pain relief and things like that, and getting them to understand when somebody's is deteriorating and things. So yeah, looking at a quality of life approach throughout the whole trajectory of dementia can be really important, and that way as well you can look at so ensuring that the person is, out of pain, minimal distress, things like that, and even looking at medication. So sometimes people are on lots and lots of medications, and we know that can cause issue in itself. And actually, if we're taking a palliative approach, maybe looking at de-prescribing some things, because that can actually improve quality of life, and the risk of things like delirium and things like that. So that sort of practical approach is really important, I think, and it helps people to understand when somebody is coming towards the end stages as well of their journey, because they're somebody like the GP has then followed them straight through and understands actually, this is a palliative condition. So yeah, I think getting that support from point of diagnosis onwards is really, really helpful, actually.
Thank you so much, Sheridan, for that great answer. And I think actually, don't you, when someone gets a diagnosis of dementia, that it, like you say, it is palliative. People are going to need support later on, and actually, what do you need to get in place early on? Get that advanced care plan in place. Think through what you might want and you might need, and those wishes. And we spoke about that at the start of the hour, didn't we? Actually, thinking in the early stage about what might a good death look like for you? What might you want that to entail? Do you want to be sitting on a balcony eating olives, or what do you want? What in those last stages of your life? So starting to get those plans in place will actually help you cope with those later stages, I think, as well. So thank you very much. I hope that was a helpful answer for you. So I'm gonna just, because we're really getting towards the last few minutes of the space, two things I want to do. I want to let you know that in April we're going to be talking about young onset. So obviously we've talked a little bit about that tonight loosely, because of Trevor was obviously young when he was diagnosed. And actually in May we're going to be talking about end of life and dying. So it felt pertinent to mention that, because both of those topics are ones we're going to be covering in our next upcoming Twitter Spaces. So do check them out if you're able to, and we'll obviously advertise those. I'm going to ask my speakers, because you've both been so amazing this evening, and the answers you've given. If there was one thing that you wanted people to know to leave this space with, what would it actually be? What would you say your kind of takeaway for people might be who've been listening this evening? And either of you can go.
I'll go first. I mean, my one overriding thing is the dementia diagnosis doesn't have to be the end of life. It can be quite a release to have that diagnosis. And I think when I look back through photos, I'm going to struggle to say this, but some of our happiest memories were after the diagnosis. Some of our best holidays were after that diagnosis. We did some amazing things together, and they are some of my happiest memories. I just think don't take that dementia diagnosis as the end of life.
Well, do you know what? Mine was going to be about focusing on the present moment and enjoying it. So the fact that you've said that, I think I'm just going to add mine straight after, because that's what you have to do, isn't it? You have to. Dementia makes you kind of live in the present a bit, doesn't it? Because you can only deal with what you're dealing with right then, and what happened yesterday or what might happen tomorrow it's so these stages we talked about, yes, think about them, but actually focus on the moment and enjoy that moment, because you've only got that moment, haven't you? It's the only one that matters. So I love that, Christine. I know we can't see each other on this space, but I'm hoping you can hear my smile on my voice. I think that's a great piece of advice. Sheridan, what would your takeaway for people be?
Yeah, I guess linking in with what Christine said is that focus on quality of life, because that is so important, and adjustments that you can make to improve quality of life throughout the different stages. Actually, that focus is so important, and also, don't be afraid to ask for support, because, as Christine says, there's some real good support out there in the community. It's just being open and honest about things, and people, can really support you to live well, for as long as possible. Because sometimes that quality of life does need to be facilitated by others, and the support is there. Sometimes you just got to reach out for it.
Perfect. I love that, and I know Keith has put up a comment about agreeing with Christine about some of the support that's available in the community, and I think that's the another key takeaway as well, isn't it? It doesn't have to have dementia on it to be able to work. Obviously, you talk about airlines and holidays, and just get out there and go horse riding, live your life. Or don't go horse riding if you don't want to do that, but if you do, go and do it, and have fun whilst you're able to. So thank you, everybody who's stayed with us the hour, everybody who's perhaps joined us later on. I hope you've managed to enjoy the conversation. If you're listening to it again, obviously you're not able to interact with us this evening or ask any questions, but I hope you found it interesting if you've listened to this on Catch Up or on our YouTube channel. So that's the end of our session this evening. Thank you to everybody who's joined us. As said, next month we're talking about young onset dementia, and in May we're talking about end of life and the latter stages of dementia. So do join us again if you're able to. But thank you very much, and thank you to my speakers this evening. Amazing session from both of you. So thank you so much. Take care, everybody. Goodbye.